Folks, you won't believe the chaos about to hit America this fall. And I'm not talking about something that might happen. I'm talking about things that are already in motion right now, today, while you're watching this. Heating oil hit $5.53 a gallon this year. A Northeast household burns 800 to 1,000 gallons in a winter. Do that math and tell me how a retired couple on a fixed income survives it. Over 584,000 American jobs have already been cut in 2026, and January alone had the highest layoff announcements since the 2009 financial crisis. 58% of companies say they're planning more cuts. Last flu season, 8.2% of all outpatient doctor visits in this country were for flu-like illness, the highest level since the CDC started tracking it in 1997, and a brand new subclade of H3N2 is now dominant. Trucking is in the longest freight recession in the history of the industry. And every single one of these things peaks in the same window. September, October, November. I've been doing this a long time, and I have never seen this many pressures stack up on the same calendar. So sit down, pay attention, and let me walk you through exactly what's coming. Heating your home this winter might cost more than your car payment. Let's start with the one that's going to hit the hardest, and the one almost nobody is talking about yet, because it's July and nobody thinks about heat in July. That is exactly the mistake. Here's the number that should stop you cold. The EIA's last official weekly reading for heating oil, week ending March 30, 2026, was $5.53 per gallon nationally and $5.58 in New England. Now understand something about how that data works, because this is important and most people have no idea. The EIA only collects heating oil and propane price data during the heating season, October through March. Then they pause. April through September, there is no weekly official price, so the last number we have is from March, and it was $5.53, and that was recorded before this year's oil market turmoil really got rolling. Now, do the arithmetic on your own house. A typical Northeast household burns roughly 800 to 1,050 gallons of heating oil per year. At the old spring quotes of $3.50 to $3.85 a gallon, that's $2,800 to $3,800 a season. At $5.53, you're looking at $4,400 to $5,800. For heat. Just heat. Not electricity, not gas for cooking, not gasoline for your car, just keeping the inside of your house above 55 degrees. That's more than most people's car payment for the year. That's more than a lot of families spend on groceries in 6 months. And here's what I need you to understand about the timing. Every single heating oil dealer in America will tell you the same thing. The best time to fill your tank is summer, June through September, when demand bottoms out and dealers are running maintenance schedules and want to move volume. The worst time is January, when everybody's tank is empty at the same time, a cold snap hits, delivery trucks are backed up 8 days deep, and the price spikes because dealers are buying on the spot market. If you have an oil tank in your basement and it's sitting half empty right now in July, you are making a very expensive mistake and you have maybe 6 to 8 weeks to fix it. Let's talk about lock-in contracts, because this is where dealers separate the informed customers from everybody else. You generally have 3 options: a variable rate, where you pay whatever the market price is on the day of delivery, a fixed price contract, where you lock a per gallon rate for the whole season, or a capped price, where you get a ceiling but still benefit if prices drop. In a normal year with stable markets, variable often wins. This is not a normal year. With the Strait of Hormuz situation, with distillate inventories running tight, with refinery throughput disrupted, the downside risk on variable is enormous, and the upside is small. Ask your dealer for a capped price contract if they offer one. If they only offer fixed, do the math on whether you can absorb being wrong. And read the fine print, because some fixed contracts require a large prepayment, and if your dealer goes out of business mid-winter, which happens more often than you'd think, that money is gone. Propane households, you have your own problem, and it's a nasty one. Here's a detail almost no homeowner knows. In October and November, a huge volume of propane gets consumed by commercial grain dryers during the corn harvest. Farmers pull corn out of the field wet, and they have to dry it down to safe moisture levels for storage, and they do that with propane-fired dryers that burn enormous quantities of fuel. When you have a big corn harvest or a wet harvest that requires more drying, agricultural propane demand spikes at exactly the same moment. Residential heating demand is ramping up. 2 enormous customer bases bidding for the same finite regional supply in the same 8-week window every single year. In 2013 and 2014, that exact collision produced a propane crisis in the Midwest, where prices more than doubled in weeks, and some rural households genuinely could not get delivery. If you heat with propane, your tank needs to be topped off before harvest, not after. Natural gas households, you're in better shape, but don't get comfortable. Natural gas covers about 46% of American home heating and electricity covers about 43%, so between them, that's the vast majority of the country. Gas storage inventories have generally been running healthy relative to the 5-year average, which is good news. But here's the catch. LNG exports out of the United States have been hitting record levels, and every cargo that sails is molecules that don't stay here. Domestic production has kept pace so far. If we get a genuinely cold winter, a prolonged wide-area cold snap of the kind that hit Texas in 2021, gas gets pulled for both home heating and electricity generation simultaneously, and that's when the storage cushion evaporates fast. So here's your action list, and I want you to actually do these, not just nod along. Fill your oil tank now, in July or August, not October. Top off your propane before the corn comes in. Call your utility and ask about budget billing to smooth your monthly payments so you're not hit with a $900 bill in January. Look up whether you qualify for LIHEAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, and apply early because funds run out. Buy a couple of quality space heaters so you can heat only the room you're actually in and let the rest of the house run cold. Get plastic film insulation kits for your windows, which cost about $15 a room, and genuinely cut heat loss. Seal your outlets and switch plates with foam gaskets. And go into your attic and look at your insulation depth, because if you can see the tops of the joists, you don't have enough, and that's where a third of your heat is going. Over 500,000 Americans have already lost their jobs this year, and the fourth quarter is when companies swing the axe. Now let's talk about something that's already happening, and that's about to accelerate dramatically. And I want to give you the raw numbers first because they're staggering. More than 584,000 jobs have been cut across 240 tracked companies so far in 2026. January of this year had the highest announced layoffs of any January since the 2009 recession. The U.S. economy lost 92,000 jobs in February alone, which was the third monthly contraction in 5 months. And 58% of companies surveyed say they plan additional layoffs before the year is out. Look at the individual names, because this isn't abstract. Amazon cut 30,000 jobs in a 3-month span. UPS announced 30,000 planned operational job reductions, along with 24 facility closures. Verizon cut over 13,000 jobs in November of 2025, cut several hundred more U.S. roles in May of 2026, and had another announcement scheduled for July. Oracle has been cutting to fund AI data center build-out. Jack Dorsey cut 40% of Block and then said publicly that he thinks most companies are late and that within the next year the majority will reach the same conclusion and make similar structural changes. Read that quote again. The CEO of a major company is telling you out loud that he expects most of corporate America to cut 40%, and here's what most people don't understand about the fourth quarter. October, November, and December are historically when companies do their heaviest restructuring. There are 3 reasons for this, and they're all boring accounting reasons that nonetheless determine whether your neighbor has a job in January. First, companies want the charge to land in the current fiscal year, so they can start the new year with a clean cost structure and show improved margins to shareholders in the first quarter. Second, budget planning for the following year happens in the fall, and that's when department heads are told to justify every head count. Third, if a company is going to miss its annual numbers, cutting payroll in Q4 is the fastest lever available to protect earnings per share. So the fall is layoff season. It always has been. And this fall it's landing on an economy that's already shed over 500,000 positions. Now let me tell you about the reason being given for a lot of these cuts, because I think it's important you understand what's actually happening. Companies attributed roughly 180,000 job cuts to artificial intelligence in 2025 alone. But here's the uncomfortable part that the layoff trackers are documenting. Most AI initiatives haven't actually delivered measurable returns yet. So what's really going on? The market rewards headcount reduction. It punishes hiring. When a company announces a layoff and attributes it to AI efficiency, the stock frequently goes up. That creates an incentive to cut first and figure out the productivity story later. Some analysts have started calling this AI washing, dressing up ordinary cost-cutting in futuristic language because investors like the story. Why does that matter to you? Because if the cuts are being driven by market incentives rather than by actual productivity gains, then the cuts don't stop when the technology matures. They continue as long as Wall Street keeps rewarding them. And there's a second pipeline running underneath all of this that gets almost no coverage, offshoring to global capability centers, particularly in India, which now employ millions of workers doing exactly the white-collar functions that used to be done here. That pipeline files no visa paperwork in this country and shows up in no immigration statistic. The job just quietly stops existing in Ohio and starts existing in Hyderabad. So what do you actually do about this? Assume it can happen to you, even if you've been somewhere 15 years, even if you're good at your job, even if your boss loves you. Restructuring decisions are made 3 levels above the people who know your work. Here's your checklist. Build a real emergency fund and target 6 months of expenses, not 3, because white-collar job searches in this market are running 6 to 9 months, not the 2 to 3 months people assume. Get your resume updated now while you're employed, because updating it after you're cut is emotionally much harder. Cultivate your network before you need it, meaning reach out to 3 people a month for coffee or a call with no agenda. Understand your company's severance policy, and critically, understand your COBRA costs, because health insurance continuation frequently runs $1,500 to $2,000 a month for a family, and that number shocks people. Pay down variable rate debt aggressively while you have income, because a credit card balance at 23% becomes a catastrophe when the paycheck stops. And develop a genuine second income stream, however small, because the psychological difference between $0 coming in and $400 coming in is enormous. A new fluo subclade is already circulating, and last season was the worst since 1997. Here's one that's genuinely serious, and that most preppers don't think about nearly enough, because we're all focused on economic collapse and grid failure, and we forget that the thing most likely to actually take you out of commission this fall is a virus. Let me give you the numbers from the 2025 to 2026 season, because they're worse than most people realize. For the week ending December 27th, the CDC reported that nearly 1 in 10 outpatient visits nationwide, 8.2%, were for flu-like illness. That is the highest level since the CDC began tracking outpatient flu visits in 1997, nearly 30 years of data, and last season set the record. By late January, the CDC estimated at least 20 million illnesses, 270,000 hospitalizations, and 11,000 deaths in a single season. And that season surpassed the 2024 to 2025 season, which the CDC had already classified as high severity. The driver was a new subclade of influenza H3N2 called subclade K, which emerged and became the predominant strain circulating in the United States and globally. And here's what you need to understand about H3N2 specifically, because not all flu is the same. H3N2 seasons are consistently the worst seasons. The virus mutates faster than H1N2 or influenza B, which means the vaccine match is often poorer, and H3N2 hits older adults disproportionately hard. If you're over 65, H3N2 seasons produce the highest hospitalization and mortality rates of any flu subtype. That's not opinion, that's decades of CDC surveillance data. Now here's the part that turns a bad flu season into a genuine crisis: hospital capacity. During previous severe respiratory seasons, U.S. hospital inpatient bed occupancy has run around 79% nationally, and pediatric bed occupancy has hit 71% of available beds. In New England, several pediatric hospitals closed entirely, and doctors reported patients traveling over 100 miles because their local pediatric hospital was full or shuttered. That was before the current wave of rural hospital closures and staffing shortages made things worse. Think about what that means practically. It's November, you're 70 years old, you've got a fever of 102, your breathing is getting labored, and you go to the emergency room. If the ER is running at capacity because half the county has the flu, you are not getting a bed quickly. You might wait 8 hours in a chair. You might be boarded in a hallway. You might be transferred an hour away, and the staff treating you are exhausted, short-handed, and triaging aggressively. That's not a failure of the doctors. That's a system running past its design limits. And it's not just flu. Fall and winter bring the convergence. Influenza, RSV, COVID, and the ordinary respiratory viruses all circulating simultaneously in the same population at the same time, which public health folks bluntly call a perfect storm. RSV in particular is brutal for infants and for adults over 65, and there are now RSV vaccines available for older adults that a shocking number of eligible people have never been told about. So let's talk about what you actually do. First, get vaccinated in September or early October, not December. Immunity takes about 2 weeks to develop and peaks then wanes, so timing matters. Late September through October is the sweet spot for flu vaccine timing. If you're 65 or older, ask specifically for the high-dose or adjuvanted flu vaccine, which is formulated for older immune systems and provides meaningfully better protection than the standard dose. Ask about the RSV vaccine if you're over 60. Ask about the pneumococcal vaccine, because secondary bacterial pneumonia is what actually kills a lot of flu patients. Second, build a home sick care kit now in advance, because the worst time to go shopping is when you already have a fever of 103. You want a reliable digital thermometer plus a backup. A pulse oximeter, which is a $20 clip that goes on your finger and reads your blood oxygen saturation. That number is the single most useful piece of home data you can have during a respiratory illness, because it tells you objectively when you need to go to the hospital rather than guessing based on how you feel. Below 92% on room air, you go in. Stock acetaminophen and ibuprofen, both because you can alternate them for stubborn fevers. Electrolyte solutions, because dehydration is what puts most flu patients in the hospital. Cough suppressants, a humidifier, tissues, and more than you think. Disposable gloves and masks, so a caregiver can care for someone without catching it. Third, and this is the one people skip, have a plan for who takes care of whom. If you're the caregiver in your household and you go down with the flu for 10 days, who takes care of your spouse? Who gets the groceries? Who picks up the prescriptions? Identify that person now and confirm they're willing. And if you're isolated, arrange a daily check-in with someone, a text or a call at a set time, so that if you stop responding, somebody notices within 24 hours rather than 4 days. And finally, prescription and supply timing. Antivirals like oseltamivir only work if started within 48 hours of symptom onset, which means you need to be able to see a provider fast. Know your urgent care options, know their hours, and know whether your insurance covers telehealth, because a telehealth visit at hour 12 of symptoms is dramatically better than an in-person appointment on day 4. And one more thing on this that I don't hear anybody say. Refill every maintenance prescription in your household in September, not October, September, because when flu season peaks, pharmacies get slammed, staffing gets thin as pharmacy workers get sick themselves, and supply chains for common medications get stretched. During previous severe seasons, there were regional shortages of children's fever reducers, amoxicillin and oseltamivir, and parents were driving to 4 different pharmacies looking for liquid acetaminophen for a feverish toddler. Get ahead of it. Ask your doctor for 90-day supplies, where your insurance allows. Stock the over-the-counter basics in September, while shelves are full and prices are normal, because the same bottle of children's fever reducer that costs $6 in September can be simply unavailable in December. Trucking is in the longest freight downturn in the history of the industry. Let me tell you about something that's happening quietly, in the background, that determines whether products show up on the shelf at your local store. The American trucking industry is in what the industry itself is calling the Great Freight Recession, and it is the longest downturn in the history of the business. Not one of the longest, the longest. Here's what's actually happening. Carriers are going under at a pace that would be front-page news in any other industry. VIB Trans, an Illinois carrier running 29 trucks with 34 drivers, filed Chapter 11. Montgomery Transport, out of Birmingham, Alabama, filed Chapter 7 and ceased operations immediately, which means the drivers found out their company no longer existed with essentially no notice. Queen Transportation shut down abruptly and left drivers and office staff suddenly unemployed. Standard Forwarding Freight, a Midwest regional less-than-truckload carrier, shut down operations. Rail Crew Express, a Kansas City company that shuttles railroad crews between job sites, laid off more than 400 employees across multiple states after losing a major contract with CSX. Ryder filed a plant closure, and in a single early 2026 stretch, more than 2,200 workers across logistics, manufacturing, and supply chain firms lost their jobs to closures, lost contracts, and bankruptcy filings spanning rail support, parcel networks, food manufacturing, packaging, last-mile delivery, and e-commerce. Now here's why you should care, even if you've never set foot in a truck. Every single thing in your house arrived on a truck. Your groceries, your medication, your propane, your heating oil, the parts to fix your furnace, the parts to fix the utility company's transformer. When carrier capacity contracts through bankruptcy, the freight doesn't disappear. It just gets redistributed to fewer carriers, which means longer lead times and higher rates. And when it happens gradually, nobody notices until a stress event hits, and suddenly there's no slack in the system to absorb it. The stress events are all scheduled for fall. Harvest requires enormous trucking capacity to move grain from farm to elevator to processor. Holiday retail requires enormous capacity to move goods to distribution centers and then to stores from October through December. Winter weather shuts down highways and delays deliveries. And propane and heating oil delivery, which is its own specialized fleet of tanker trucks, ramps to maximum in exactly the same window. 4 massive demands on a shrinking pool of trucks, drivers, and fuel, all in the same 90 days. There's a second layer to this that concerns me more. Fuel. Diesel specifically. Distillate fuel inventories, which include both diesel and heating oil because they come out of the same part of the barrel, have been running below the 5-year average. And this is the crucial thing most people don't know. Diesel and home heating oil are essentially the same product. They compete for the same refinery output. So when heating demand spikes in the Northeast in November, it pulls from the same distillate pool that fuels every truck in America. That's why diesel prices and heating oil prices move together, and why a brutal cold snap raises the price of everything in the store, not just your heating bill. And here's the part where it gets personal for rural America. When a regional less-than-truckload carrier shuts down, the routes that disappear first are the unprofitable ones. Which routes are unprofitable? The long, low-density rural routes. The small town 2 hours from the distribution center that gets one delivery a week. So the contraction in trucking capacity hits rural and small town America first and hardest, and it shows up as your local hardware store not being able to get restocked, your farm supply place having longer lead times on parts, and your pharmacy waiting an extra 2 days on an order. So what's your move? Stop thinking in terms of running to the store when you need something, and start thinking in terms of depth. If you use a critical part, a filter, a belt, a specific medication, a specific fuel additive, hold 2 or 3, not 1. If you heat with oil or propane, get on your dealer's automatic delivery list rather than call when low, because automatic customers get prioritized during backlogs and will call customers wait. If you have a well pump, a furnace, a generator, or any critical mechanical system, buy the wear parts now and have them on the shelf. Identify a local source for everything you'd normally order online, because local sources have local inventory and don't depend on a 2,000-mile supply chain. And build a relationship with your local suppliers, because when supply gets tight, the guy behind the counter takes care of the customers he knows by name first. That's not corruption, that's human nature, and it works in your favor if you've done the work in advance. The holiday debt trap is about to spring on a consumer who is already maxed out. All right, this is the one that I think is going to do the most quiet damage to the most American families, and it happens every single year, and this year the setup is uniquely dangerous. Credit card balances in this country sit at approximately $1.25 trillion as of the first quarter of 2026, according to the New York Fed's Household Debt and Credit Report. Year over year, that's up $70 billion, about 5.9%. And buy now, pay later, and other consumer loans add another $562 billion on top of that. Now here's the seasonal pattern, and it's remarkably consistent. Balances dip in the first quarter, then build through the year, then spike hard in the fourth quarter during the holiday spending season, and then families spend the next 6 to 9 months digging out. Except this year, they're not starting from a normal baseline. They're starting from a position where the personal savings rate has collapsed to 2.6%, where 29% of buy now, pay later users are financing groceries, where credit card delinquency at smaller banks has hit 6.43%, and where 95% of Americans tell pollsters the country is in an affordability crisis. So the holiday spending spree this year isn't going to be funded by savings and discretionary income. It's going to be funded by credit, on top of credit by families who are already stretched. Let me walk you through the mechanics of how this actually destroys people, because it's not obvious. Say a family charges $3,000 over the holidays across gifts, travel, and food. That feels manageable in December. At a 23% APR, if they make minimum payments only, that $3,000 takes roughly 15 years to pay off and costs them about $4,000 in interest. They will pay more in interest than the gifts cost, and that's assuming they never charge another dollar. Which of course they will, because in February the furnace breaks and in April the car needs tires. Buy now, pay later makes this worse in a way that most people don't see coming, and I want to explain it carefully. BNPL splits a purchase into 4 payments, typically due every 2 weeks. That sounds harmless, but here's the trap. People take out multiple BNPL loans across multiple providers, and no single provider sees the full picture, because much of this debt doesn't report to the traditional credit bureaus consistently. So a family might have 6 active BNPL plans from 4 different companies, with payments hitting on different days, and nobody, including the family, has a consolidated view of what's actually due. Then a payment bounces, and the late fees start, and the provider reports the delinquency, and the whole thing unravels in January. And I want to be clear about something because I think shame is a huge part of why people don't deal with this. If you're carrying a balance, you are not a financial failure. Median household income has barely moved in real terms while housing is up 81% since 2017. Healthcare premiums have exploded, insurance has doubled in some states, and groceries have climbed relentlessly. The math genuinely doesn't work for millions of households doing everything right. The debt is a symptom of a structural gap, not a character flaw. But understanding that doesn't make the interest go away, so we still have to deal with it. Here's your plan, and I want you to start this in August, not December. First, set a hard holiday number now while you're calm and it's still summer, and make it cash only. Whatever that number is, $100, $500, whatever your budget genuinely supports, put it in an envelope or a separate account starting in August and add to it weekly. 5 months of small contributions is dramatically easier than one enormous January bill. Second, have the conversation with your family now. Talk to your siblings about doing a name draw instead of everybody buying for everybody. Talk to your kids about a smaller Christmas. That conversation is awkward in August and impossible in December, when the expectations are already set. Third, if you're carrying balances, know your actual APR on every card, write them down on one sheet of paper, and attack the highest rate first while paying minimums on the rest. Fourth, call your card issuers and ask directly for a rate reduction. This works far more often than people believe, particularly if you have a decent payment history, and it costs you one phone call. Fifth, do not take on new BNPL plans in Q4. If you have existing ones, list every single one on paper with the provider, the amount, and the due dates so you can actually see the total. And sixth, if the Fed does raise rates and prediction markets are pricing meaningful odds of a hike, every variable rate balance you carry gets more expensive automatically. Pay those down first. Winter grid reliability is the thing that could turn a bad fall into a disaster. Now let's talk about the wild card that turns every other problem on this list, from difficult into dangerous. The electrical grid in winter. NERC's, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is the organization responsible for monitoring grid reliability across the continent, issued a stark warning in its recent reliability report. Surging winter electricity demand, driven significantly by the proliferation of AI data centers, has placed much of North America at risk of failing to meet power needs during extreme operating conditions. Their exact framing was that while resources are adequate for normal winter peak demand, any prolonged wide-area cold snaps will be challenging. Here's the number that should get your attention. Total electricity demand has grown by 20 gigawatts since last winter, and NERC explicitly stated that this is significantly outpacing winter on-peak capacity. 20 gigawatts in 1 year. For scale, a large nuclear reactor produces about 1 gigawatt. So the grid absorbed the equivalent of 20 new nuclear plants worth of demand in 12 months without building 20 nuclear plants worth of generation. And John Mora, NERC's Director of Reliability Assessments, said something that I want you to really sit with. He said electricity demand continues to grow faster than the resources being added to the grid, especially during the most extreme winter conditions, where actual demand can topple forecasts by as much as 25%, as we saw in 2021 in ERCOT and SPP. That's the Texas grid and the Southwest Power Pool during Winter Storm Uri. 25% above forecast. That's the margin of error that nearly killed the Texas grid. Let me remind you what Uri actually looked like, because it's the template. February 2021. A prolonged cold snap covered Texas. Demand spiked far beyond what anyone modeled. Generation failed because equipment wasn't winterized. Gas wellheads froze, and the gas supply that fuels the power plants that heat the homes was itself interrupted by the cold. CRUT came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of a complete grid collapse. Grid engineers have said publicly that a full collapse would have taken weeks to months to restore, because you cannot simply flip a switch and restart a continental power grid. It's called a black start, and it is an extraordinarily difficult, sequential days-to-weeks process. At least 246 people died. Economic damage exceeded $195 billion. Now here's what's different in 2026. Data centers. NERC has flagged voltage-sensitive data center loads as a new and largely unplanned-for class of grid stability risk, and has launched a large loads task force specifically to study their impact. Understand why this matters. Residential air conditioning demand drops off at night. Data centers do not. They pull power around the clock at a constant, enormous rate, and the grid was designed for demand that rises and falls with human activity. NERC's long-term assessment projects that summer peak demand could surge by 224 gigawatts over the next decade, which is 69% more than the 132 gigawatts projected in the previous assessment. The forecast for how much power we're going to need went up by 69% in one revision cycle. Meanwhile, conventional generation keeps retiring. Coal plants close, older gas plants close, and replacements are not coming online fast enough. NERC's own words, our infrastructure is not being built fast enough to keep up with the rising demand. So what does this mean for you this fall and winter? It means the probability of a rolling blackout or an extended outage during a cold event is meaningfully higher than it was 5 years ago, particularly if you're in a region NERC has flagged. And it means that a grid event stacked on top of everything else on this list, expensive heat, a bad flu season, a strained supply chain, is where a difficult winter becomes a genuine emergency. Your preparation here is straightforward, but you have to actually do it. Know your utilities outage reporting number and have it written down on paper. Sign up for your utilities outage alerts by text. If anyone in your household depends on electrically powered medical equipment, call your utility today and get on their medical baseline registry, because that changes your restoration priority and it costs nothing. Have a heat plan that does not require grid power, meaning a properly vented propane or kerosene heater with adequate fuel and a battery carbon monoxide detector to go with it, because more people die from improper heating during outages than from the cold itself. Know how to shut off your water main and how to drain your pipes, because frozen and burst pipes during a winter outage cause more property damage than almost anything else. Keep faucets dripping during hard freezes. Open cabinet doors under sinks on exterior walls. And identify right now where you would go if your home became uninhabitable, whether that's a relative's house, a hotel 2 counties over, or a designated warming center, and make sure you can get there with a half tank of gas. Grocery prices don't spike during a bad harvest. They spike 4 months later, and the clock started in June. Here's a piece of the puzzle that almost nobody understands correctly. And understanding it is the difference between buying at today's price and paying tomorrow's. Grocery prices do not spike when a crop fails. They spike about 90 to 120 days later, when the reduced harvest works its way through the milling, processing, and distribution pipeline and finally reaches the shelf. That lag is why people get caught. A farmer in Kansas knows in June that his wheat yield is down 30%. The grain elevator knows in July. The miller knows in August. The commercial baker knows in September, when his flour contract reprices. And you find out in October when the loaf of bread costs $1 more. 4 months of warning, and the average shopper gets exactly 0 days of it because nobody translates the farm data into grocery language. So let me translate. The 2026 wheat harvest is confirmed as the smallest since 1972, with some analysts calling the winter wheat crop the smallest since 1965. Kansas, which is the #1 wheat state, is looking at production down as much as 31%, according to pro-farmer modeling, with heavy field abandonment across the central and southwestern counties. Nebraska is harvesting only about 580,000 acres, down 225,000 from the prior year, with 36% of planted fields abandoned entirely and 82% of the crop rated poor or very poor. Colorado's harvest is the worst since 1965, coming in at 33.6 million bushels, which is 52% below the 10-year average. Now here's why that matters more than most people think. Wheat isn't a product. It's an ingredient in an enormous share of the American diet. Flour, bread, pasta, pizza dough, tortillas, crackers, cookies, cake, cereal, breading on your chicken, thickener in your gravy, filler in processed foods, communion wafers, dog treats, and beer. When wheat gets expensive, several hundred grocery items get expensive simultaneously, and they do it quietly, a few cents at a time over about 12 weeks. The beef situation runs on an even longer clock, and it's worse. The U.S. cattle herd has shrunk to roughly 86.7 million head, the lowest level since the early 1950s. That's a 75-year low. And here's the thing about cattle that makes this different from wheat. You can plant more wheat next spring. You cannot plant a cow. Gestation is 9 months. Then the calf needs another 18 to 24 months to reach market weight. So even if every rancher in America decided today to rebuild their herd, and even if the pastures recovered, and even if the feed was affordable, the first additional pound of beef reaches the meat case in roughly 2029. Fortune's reporting has beef prices not normalizing until at least 2028. Ground beef is already running around $7 a pound nationally, and in Hawaii, where everything ships in, it's hitting 13 to 18. Then there's the input side, which is the piece nobody covers: fertilizer. The Strait of Hormuz disruption has blocked Gulf fertilizer exports, and the FAO issued a warning that the resulting scarcity will affect next harvests and food supplies. Nitrogen fertilizer, which is synthesized from natural gas, is what makes modern corn yields possible. In Arkansas, nitrogen costs spiked roughly 30% in early 2026, and farmers responded exactly the way you'd expect. They shifted acreage away from corn toward soybeans, which need less nitrogen. In Wyoming, similar crop mix changes have been documented. Every acre that shifts from corn to a lower input crop is a reduction in total caloric output. And unlike a drought, This one is a deliberate economic response that shows up in the numbers a year later. And there is no strategic fertilizer reserve. Let that sink in. We have a strategic petroleum reserve for oil. We have no equivalent for the chemical inputs that make the food supply function. When the supply gets interrupted, there is no release valve. The farmers absorb it, then the yields absorb it, then you absorb it at the register. So here's your practical playbook, and the timing matters enormously. Buy your shelf-stable staples now, in the summer, before the 90 to 120-day lag from the June harvest data catches up in October. That means flour, and here's a pro tip most people don't know. Whole wheat berries stored properly last upwards of 30 years, while milled flour goes rancid in about a year because the oils in the germ oxidize. If you're serious about depth, buy wheat berries and a hand crank mill rather than bags of flour. Buy rice, dried beans, pasta, oats, canned proteins, cooking oil, sugar, salt, and coffee at today's prices. Buy a second freezer if you have the space and the power budget, and fill it during the fall meat sales, because meat sales in October and November are the last good pricing before the beef contraction fully bites. Learn to shop the shrinkflation. Start checking unit price, the price per ounce, rather than the sticker price, because the sticker price stays flat while the package shrinks. A half-gallon of ice cream that's now a quart and a half is a 25% price increase disguised as no change at all. Most grocery store shelf tags list the unit price in small print. Train yourself to read it, and you'll spot the increases months before you'd notice them any other way. And finally, consider what your grandparents did, because they lived through exactly this. Grow something, even if it's a container of tomatoes and herbs on a patio. Learn one preservation skill this fall, whether that's water bath canning, fermenting, or dehydrating. Buy in bulk with 2 or 3 other families and split a case, which drops your per-unit cost dramatically and builds the exact neighbor relationships you're going to want anyway. And keep a written price log of 10 items you buy every week. It takes 2 minutes at the register. In 3 months, you'll have hard personal data on what's actually happening to your food budget, and you'll see the increases coming before the news reports them. Every one of these pressures lands in the same 90-day window, and that's what makes it different. I want to pull this all together now, because the individual pieces are concerning, but the convergence is what genuinely worries me, and I don't think most people have connected the dots. Look at the calendar. September harvest begins. Propane demand for grain drying spikes, flu season starts, layoff planning for Q4 gets finalized, and heating dealers start filling tanks. October, EIA resumes weekly heating oil and propane price reporting, so we finally see the real numbers. The heating season officially begins. Holiday retail inventory floods the freight network, flu activity climbs, and fourth quarter restructuring announcements start landing. November, cold snaps begin in earnest. Grid demand peaks for winter, holiday spending accelerates on credit, flu and RSV converge, and freight capacity hits maximum strain. December, heating bills arrive. The credit card statements arrive in January, reflecting December. Hospital capacity peaks, and the grid faces its highest risk period. Now stack the household math. A Northeast family heating with oil is looking at potentially $4,400 to $5,800 for the season. Spread across roughly 5 months, so call it $900 to $1,100 a month during peak. Add holiday spending, even a modest $1,500, financed at 23%. Add the possibility that one wage earner in the household is among the hundreds of thousands being cut in Q4. Add a 10-day flu that costs a week of income for an hourly worker plus urgent care copays. Add elevated grocery prices from the wheat shortfall and the beef shortage. And do all of it starting from a 2.6% savings rate, which means the average household has roughly $170 a month of cushion. The math does not work. Not for the family. Not for millions of families. And when the math doesn't work at a household level across millions of households simultaneously, you get exactly what the data has been showing. Savings depletion, rising delinquency, BNPL for groceries, skipped medical care, and food bank demand that exceeds supply. So let me give you the consolidated action plan, in priority order, and I want you to work through it over the next 6 weeks. Number 1. Energy. Fill your oil or propane tank this month while summer pricing holds and before harvest demand hits. Get on automatic delivery. Look into a capped price contract. Apply for LIHE HEAP if you might qualify, and apply early. Number 2. Financial. Set your holiday budget now in cash. Have the family conversation about smaller gifts in August, not December. List every debt with its APR on one sheet of paper. Call your card companies and ask for rate reductions. Build or extend your emergency fund towards 6 months. Number 3. Employment. Update your resume this week while you're still employed. Reach out to 3 people in your network this month. Find out your severance policy and your actual COBRA cost. Number 4, health. Get flu vaccinated in late September or early October, and ask specifically about high dose if you're 65 plus. Build your home sick kit, including a pulse oximeter. Arrange your caregiver plan and your daily check-in. Number 5, supply depth. Buy the wear parts for your critical systems now. Build 2 to 3 weeks of shelf-stable food and water. Get on first-name terms with your local suppliers. Number 6, grid and cold. Get on the utility medical registry if applicable. Set up a non-electric heat source with proper ventilation and a battery CO detector. Learn your water shutoff. Identify your fallback location. And number 7, which is the one that actually matters most and costs nothing. Talk to your neighbors. Every single crisis I've described gets dramatically easier when 3 or 4 households coordinate. One family with a generator, one with a chainsaw, one with a truck, one with medical training, and suddenly a nightmare becomes a manageable inconvenience. The families that come through hard winters intact are almost never the ones with the most gear. They're the ones who knew who lived next door. Folks, I'm not telling you any of this to frighten you. I'm telling you because every item on this list is documented, sourced, and on a calendar. Heating oil at 553. 584,000 jobs already gone, with 58% of companies planning more. A flu season that set a record going back to 1997 with a new dominant subclade. The longest freight recession in the industry's history. 1.25 trillion in credit card debt heading into the highest spending quarter of the year. And a grid that NERC itself says is not being built fast enough to keep up. None of that is speculation. None of that is speculation. All of it is on the record. You have about 6 weeks before the first of these starts landing. 6 weeks is enough time to fill a tank, set a budget, update a resume, get a flu shot, buy some parts, and knock on a few doors. It is not enough time if you start in October. Start this week, and do me one favor. Pick the single item on this list that scared you the most, whatever it was, the heating bill or the layoffs or the flu or the grid, and do one concrete thing about it today. Not this weekend. Today. Make the phone call, fill the tank, set the budget. Because preparation is never one big heroic act, it's 100 small ones, and the only one that matters is the next one. Thank you for watching, folks. Like, subscribe, hit the bell, and go call your heating oil dealer today.